Welcome to Dr. Summary. Today we will understand a very famous novel so-called as Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is an autobiographical novel written by Charlotte Brontë. The novel was written in 1847. Its setting is in northern England in the early 18th century, and this novel is from the Victorian period. So these were the key facts of this novel. Now let us commence with our story. So the story begins with Jane Eyre, who is an orphan and is the protagonist of this story. She is now living with her uncle and aunt at a place named Gateshead. The name of her uncle and aunt is Mr. and Mrs. Reed, out of which her uncle, that is Mr. Reed, is dead. On the other hand, Mrs. Reed and her children do not treat Jane well. They treat Jane very badly. But there is a maid in this house who treats Jane very well. The name of the maid is Bessie Lee. One fine day, a fight takes place between Jane and her cousins. So Jane gets a punishment from Mrs. Reed for doing the fight. Although she didn't started it, yet she gets the punishment. Under punishment, Mrs. Reed locks Jane in a room. The name of that room is Red Room. This is the same room where Uncle Reed had died many years ago. So while living in this room, Jane feels that the ghost of her uncle, Uncle Reed, is scaring her. Jane starts getting scared while in that room. Later, Mrs. Reed takes her out of the room. Few days later, Mrs. Reed sends Jane to an institution called Lowood School. Friends, let me tell you that Lowood School is a charity school which is run by a very terrible man. That man's name is Mr. Brocklehurst. He is a very useless man who is also very selfish. And this man runs the school. It is in this school that Jane is sent. In this school, Jane makes a friend named Helen Burns. This girl helps Jane to stay in the school. And friends, let me tell you that this Helen herself used to be sick. So one day comes that Jane's friend Helen dies due to her terrible health. After few days, very dreadful disease was spreading among the students of the school. The new management of the school made many efforts to prevent this disease. Later, Jane lived with her teachers and received education for 6 years, after which Jane herself became a teacher. We can say a private teacher. Jane spent 8 years of her life in this school, where she studied for 6 years and became a teacher herself for 2 years, and taught others. In this school, Jane had a very favorite teacher whose name was Maria Temple. This teacher left the Lowood School after getting married, and by this time Jane was 18 years old, and she too was to become a private teacher. So she started looking out for a private teacher job. As Jane was looking for a private teacher job, later she was hired by a person for the job of a private tutor. The person who hired Jane was Mr. Rochester. Jane's job was to educate and look after his child. Mr. Rochester had hired Jane to guide his daughter. Mr. Rochester was the owner of a place named Thornfield, and this man had a very dark complexion, which means his skin color was dark. One fine day, a fire breaks out in Rochester's bedroom. At this point, Jane saves Rochester's life. And at this point, Jane was falling in love with Rochester, and later Jane used to help Rochester like this many times. And while helping like this, Jane fell in love with Rochester. But there comes a day where Jane's heart is broken, because one day Rochester brings home a clever girl whose name was Blanche. And seeing this, Jane feels that Rochester will propose the clever girl. But here something different happens. Mr. Rochester soon proposes Jane, and now Jane can't even believe that Rochester has proposed her. And what happened after that is Jane accepts Rochester's proposal, as she herself liked him. One fine day comes when Rochester announces that he and Jane would get married. After announcing this, their wedding day arrived. So on the day of the wedding, both of them were ready to get wed. But then a man comes and says that Mr. Rochester has been married before, and then the same man comes in front of everyone and tells that he is Mr. Rochester's brother-in-law, and his name is Richard Mason. In other words, he is the brother of Mr. Rochester's wife. He later says that Mr. Rochester has married my sister named Bertha Mason when he was young, and Mr. Rochester does not deny this, and admits to Jane that he had married before. Along with this, Mr. Rochester also says that my first wife, that is Richard Mason's sister, has gone mad. And all the people who are present there listen to all these things. After this, Mr. Rochester takes everyone to the third floor of his house. And on the same third floor lives his first wife and Richard's sister, Bertha. At the same time, Rochester tells everyone that I was tricked into marrying his sister. And now she has gone mad and keeps doing crazy things in my house. After this, Mr. Rochester says to Jane that, look, I have already told the truth and now let's get married. But Jane refuses. On next day, Jane quietly runs away in the morning without speaking to anyone. That is, she runs away from Mr. Rochester's house. But after that, Jane's condition becomes very bad. Jane have to beg and have to sleep on the roads. She gets very upset. But despite being so upset, she finds a place. She finds a house where she gets a place to live. And this house is the home of 3 siblings, St. John Rivers, Mary, and Diana. St. John Rivers is the brother of these 2 sisters and also the owner of this house. He is a priest in the church. He arranges a job for Jane. He arranges for her a job as a teacher in a village school. When Jane was living together with these 3 siblings, a surprising moment comes where Jane comes to know that these 3 siblings are the cousins of Jane. So these 3 siblings and Jane's are cousins, and the father had left money for Jane, which sums around £20,000. So it was £20,000 that later Jane accepts. But Jane later shared the money with her 2 cousin sisters, Mary and Diana. While staying in this house, Jane realized in her mind and got feelings that Mr. Rochester was calling her. One day she suddenly leaves everything and goes to Mr. Rochester's house. But when she reaches there, she saw that Rochester's entire house had been burned to ashes. Jane learns that Mr. Rochester's crazy wife has set her own house on fire and after burning down the whole house, jumps off the roof and kills herself. And in this incident, Rochester didn't die, but Rochester lost one hand and both his eyes. She learns that Rochester is living in a different place with 2 servants. Later, after knowing the place where Rochester is living now, Jane goes to visit him. After visiting to Rochester's place, Jane promises to Rochester that she will always be with her and take care of him. And in the end, both of them get married with each other. They produce a son together and slowly Rochester starts to get vision back. And with this, the story ends with a happy ending.